Good evening. Before Professor Raman Mahadevan begins his talk, let me quickly introduce him to you. Professor Raman Mahadevan is a senior economic and business historian. He has over 35 years of teaching and research experience in various universities and research institutions of repute, such as the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, Department of History at Rajasthan University, the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, and the Jamia Millia Islamia. Dr. Mahadevan has made significant scholarly contributions to modern South Indian studies, especially in the area of industrialist and capitalist development in colonial South India. He has several publications to his credit. He is one of the editors of the recently published volume, Shaping India Economic Change in Historical Perspective. His forthcoming publication is titled Fortune Seekers, The Journeys of the Nathukote Chettiars. Through his detailed studies of entrepreneurship in Nathukote Chettiar community, followed by those relating to Coimbatore and Tamil Nadu and later Travancore, he has managed to bring South India into the forefront of major debates on Indian economic history. Over the several years, he has been focusing attention on the more contemporary period, and some of these concerns were reflected in his fortnightly column, Past is Present in the Financial Express. He is presently an independent researcher at Chennai. Today, he will be talking to us about the changing economic landscape of Colonial Madras. Before he begins his talk, I, on behalf of ISMR, CDF, and Transparent Chennai, would like to thank you, sir, for accepting this invitation.
Hello everyone, and let me at the outset take this opportunity to thank the organizers, Spark Change Objectives, and in particular Mr. Russell and Soumya of TDF for having extended the invitation, for having given me the opportunity to share my thoughts, and for which I feel deeply honored. Can I just switch this on the... Hey, push that first button.
Okay.
So, our PowerPoint presentation is really limited to the maps, a few maps, give one idea of what I'm really talking about, but otherwise I have a prepared text and I just read out. At the very outset, I think it would be in order to indicate by way of a caveat that this is a much too complex a theme for me to be able to do anything more than skim the surface, as it were, especially given the constraints of time. Because I don't want to ramble on for too long. I'll just provide, as I said, a snapshot view of the change that is overtaking Chennai between 1850 and 1945. It's a very critical period. An extremely economically turbulent period. Right. The other caveat that needs to be underlined is one that most historians face, which relates to the question of the limitation stemming from the availability and the quality of data and information. This is particularly true with respect to the reconstructing, with respect to reconstructing the social and economic processes that underlay colonial urbanization. Colonial archives, while an important repository for historical data and information of a certain kind, yield less information for our inquiry. The two important social segments or classes which played an important role in shaping the modern city, namely capital and labor, quote unquote in the broader sense, and I include organized and the unorganized sector, and capital would include the large, the medium, and the small, do not figure as centrally in the colonial discourse as one would wish. The working poor from the socially disadvantaged groups, being largely semi or illiterate, have not left any accounts behind for one to reconstruct their lives and experiences, somewhat in contrast to the representatives of capital. For this and other reasons, the working poor do not, most unfortunately, feature at all in the existing past literature on Madras.
What I propose to do is to provide a snapshot overview of the broad yet complex processes, largely economic, that as it were paved the way for the evolution of what was quintessentially a colonial urban conglomeration that was then known as Madras. I am sure most of you present here are aware of the broad contours of the story of Madras, especially of the popular genre. The historical pattern of urbanization of Madras was largely mediated through the process of colonial commercialization and integration of the larger region within the then global market with its epicenter in London. And I think it would be only appropriate for me to underline the fact that at least insofar as Madras is concerned, the urban studies have tried to look at Madras in isolation from the larger region, the larger southern region and the larger global market. And I think it's imperative to be able to contextualize the change that was overtaking Chennai. It does need to have a comparative perspective. Though a relatively poor cousin of the other two contemporary major urban centers, namely Bombay and Calcutta, yet in many respects the pattern of transformation, the forces of change unleashed as a consequence of colonial intervention were not entirely dissimilar. In short, the central point of my presentation is to underscore at the very outset the importance of commerce, finance, and subsequently industry, and emerging out of it the hegemonic influence of the market in shaping the evolving morphology of the city. Economics was undoubtedly the driving force in shaping the city. This aspect, unfortunately, has not been accorded the primacy deserved in the sparse literature on the city. The literature and history of Madras can be broadly grouped into two categories, namely the popular and the academic. The former can be broadly characterized as one bordering on nostalgic romanticization of colonial heritage as represented through its architectural remains and institutions. Historical research clearly needs to go beyond the mere description of events and landmarks. These accounts fall short of unraveling the economic forces as well as the social agency involved in the process of transformation of urban social space. The latter, or the academic studies, while insightful, have tended to mainly focus on the early mercantilist colonial phase of the history, when Madras was largely an outpost for servicing the growing need for South Indian textiles by the East India Company. This is also a phase marked by internecine conflict between the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, and the Indian rulers, particularly Tipu Sultan, for decisive control and hegemony over trade and the region. While this is undoubtedly an important phase in transforming the relatively insignificant and modest urban settlement of Madras Patnam, when Francis Day set foot on it in 1614 and set up a Fort St. George, into what emerged as the important city and the capital of the Madras presidency by the early 19th century. Yet it is the post-1850 period that was clearly the most important phase in transforming Madras into a major modern commercial metropolis in this part of the subcontinent, and we shall focus on this period. The period from mid-18th century till the early 19th century was one when East India Company was seeking to establish its hegemony over the region, and apart from carrying on trade, had to put in place a system of administration all across South India. The period from the late 18th and early 19th century also coincided with the rise of new social forces in England following the Industrial Revolution, which were increasingly gaining supremacy over the British political sphere. This had a big bearing on its interventionist policies in India. The Charter Acts of 1813 and 1833 were symptomatic of these trends. 1830 Act allowed open entry to all traders, because till then, East India Company had a monopoly over trade and nobody else could trade. Of course, privately you had the officials of the East India Company trading on their private accounts, but none of the other traders could gain entry into the Indian market. So 1830 in that sense was a very important landmark in that it did away with the monopoly of the East India Company over the very valuable East Indian trade. 1833 was again a very important landmark constitutional act, in that it did away with East India Company's right to trade itself. Between 1833 and 1868, East India Company was left to just administer India. The Act of 1858 ended company rule. It marked a new phase in the economic history of India. Colonial India was to be cast as an important market for British manufactured goods, as well as a source of raw material for its growing industry. This required opening up the region for systematic and effective utilization of the colonial resources. Investment in infrastructure was perceived as a means for fulfilling effective integration of colonial India with global markets. Now, I talk about investment in infrastructure, which began to be put in place starting from 1850, but a process which carried on till about the first quarter of the 19th century and continued, because modern technology was evolving, and with the evolution of modern technology, changes came about. The post-mid-19th century literally witnessed a transport and communications revolution, the effects of which were felt all across the globe, and India and Madras were no exception. And I should start with the coming of the railway. And I think, unfortunately, the literature on the making of the Indian railways is again very sparse. E.N.J. Kurt is probably among the few who has doggedly sort of continued researching in this area for over 30 years now. And I wish more scholars would work on all aspects of what railways meant, because railways was in many ways a major sort of catalyst to change of all sorts in India at that time. The coming of the railway was a major catalyst to heightened mobility of goods and people, and contributed significantly in integrating markets and regions. The emergence of an all-India market was in no small measure the result of the spread of railways in the course of the 19th century. Both the Madras Railways and the Great South Indian Railways, with headquarters in Madras and Trichinopoly, respectively, were sterling companies which were registered in London in 1853. And these were subsidized by the government of India because they were all guaranteed a return. Of course, there again there was a difference. While the companies up in the north were guaranteed a return of 5%, the southern railways were guaranteed a return of 4.5%. Even 0.5% made a lot of difference. It'd be interesting to see why they decided to cut down the returns on southern railways. So you have the first railway line being constructed in 1856, a stretch very interestingly from Royapuram, very close to the harbour, up there, to a place called Valajanagar. Sorry, I should stop. Here. And Valajanagar would be, Perampur, and then beyond. It was known as Arcot then, the stretch from Rayapuram to Arcot. Arcot is now known as Valajanagar. That was the first stretch that was of 104 kilometers, which was constructed in a matter of about 3 years or so. And then, of course, the line is extended to Jolarpet, and then beyond to Erode and Coimbatore, and eventually ends up in Calicut. That is one stretch, the entire west coast. And the other stretch from Jolarpet to Bangalore. And the link between Bangalore and Mysore was under the State Railways, which was eventually acquired by the MSM Railways, by the Madras Railways. That was one stretch. And the South Indian Railways, which was also set up in 1853, was with its headquarters in Trichinopoly. The first railway line, interestingly, was from Trichinopoly to Nagapattinam, which was also a very important port at that time. And then there is another line which is extended from Trichy via Madurai to Tuticorin by about 1880s or so. That line is ready. So it is very interesting. All these railway lines were linked to major ports, Tuticorin, Nagapattinam, and Madras. And Madras was not as important a port, especially in relation to Bombay and Calcutta, partly because it didn't have a proper harbour until 1905. The first pier was constructed in 1868 because of the pressure of the European commercial interests. Otherwise, the goods were offloaded from the ship in mid-sea to what were known as Masula ports and transferred by the Masula ports by the people by the fisher folk onto the shore. So it is a very cumbersome process of transshipment, and which in a sense discouraged the flow of goods. And so therefore there was intense lobbying for a proper harbour, which eventually comes into being only as late as 1905. So you can imagine you had a proper harbour in Bombay and Calcutta by well before the mid-19th century, and it took almost 60 years thereafter for a proper harbour to come into being. And it's important to bear this in mind when we talk about the lag between Madras and the other regions. This was one of the reasons why there was no adequate infrastructure available. Railways were conceived mainly to facilitate movement of produce from the hinterland to the ports, and for the reverse traffic of imported finished goods to the hinterland. The freight structure principally favored such movements, and this comes out very clearly in all the evidence which has been given to the Indian Industrial Commission in 1916 by some of the representatives of merchant capital from South India, who said that when they tried transporting goods from one inland center to the inland center, they found the cost extremely prohibitive. Whereas if they tried transporting goods from the inland center to the ports, it was much cheaper. So clearly, it favored exports and imports. The construction of railways required sourcing of enormous local and outside skilled labor. Managerial and supervisory staff were mostly Europeans. The story of the arduous task of the construction of railways in southern India with the help of Indian labor is waiting to be written. Enormous quantity of wood from the South Indian forests was consumed by the railways both as sleepers and as fuel, with detrimental consequences for the environment. The railways also provided a market for British steel and rolling stock, all of which was imported. Now, the other important, all as part of infrastructure, I just quickly run through this. 1845, you have the electric telegraph office set up, aiding communication. You had a telegraph office where you could send communication, which is so vital to any business transaction. So that comes into being in Madras in 1845. 1881, again, a very important landmark event. Oriental Telephone Company, a sterling company based in London, is given the license to set up telephone exchanges in 5 major centers. These are Calcutta, Bombay, 4. Calcutta, Bombay, Rangoon, and Madras. There was no Delhi. The Delhi capital shift from the 1911. So they were given licenses. So you have the first modern telephone exchange coming to Madras in 1881. At that point of time, there were 40 lines with 24 subscribers. By 1910, you have 350 subscribers. So you can see it's still very, very small. I mean, you're talking about 350 people who had the wherewithal, who could be counted as, the wealthy at this point of time, who could afford a telephone. I'm talking about 1910, as late as 1910. In 1923, there's a change of management. The telephone services is taken away from the Oriental Telephone Company, and a new company is constituted in Madras called the Madras Telephone Company, again controlled by local foreign capital, local European capital, and it's promoted as a rupee company, and the number of lines increases to 1,224. And so on. And and the lines continue to increase. And between 1927 and 1932, for the first time, underground cables are laid in Madras. The underground cable lines are laid, and the spatial coverage is also extended to other parts, various parts of Madras. 1941, the government of Madras, the government of India, takes control over telephones because it is considered for security reasons vital. So it comes under direct control. Madras Tramway Company is established in 1904. It was a major mode of transport, employing several hundred workers for transporting people from one part of Madras to the other. And you should remember that the major hub at this point of time was Fort St. George was no longer by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th, no longer the seat of power. It is transformed into barracks for the army, and the major commercial hub was around the harbour. What's called Black Town? It's in fact now known as Georgetown, which is Black Town, but it is not entirely black. There was a mingling of black and the white, because the row of offices on this side were all occupied by the English, European, or the English managing agencies. They all had their office, whether it's Parry's, whether it's Binney's, Gordon Woodrow, Western Company, Times and Co. So they all had their offices there, close to the harbour, so that they could, easily, they had warehouses there so that they could transport the commodities and oversee the transportation of commodities to the harbour. And on this side of the thing were the Indian merchants and traders, a large number of them, basically middlemen traders who were helping push the imported commodities into the market in the interiors of South India. That's the morphology. You have the Madras Electricity Company being set up in 1907, again a very important development. And interestingly, the managing agents of this company, those who manage this company, were Binney and Company. So you have here a straddling of interest. So you have a major trading company, Binney. They're one of the largest. Binney and Parry's by the 19th century, the late 19th century. I mean, both Binney's and Parry's have a vintage going back in time to the 18th century, but they were two of the largest sort of European trading agencies who had gone into manufacturing as well. I'll come to that later. So the Madras Electricity Company, set up under the management of Binney, set up a thermal power station in Basin Bridge, not very far from Central Station. So that was where the Basin Bridge to provide electricity. But the spread of electricity was very slow. I talked about modernization of the harbour, which really got underway in 1868 and was completed only in 1895, and the harbour itself becomes functional only after 1905. So this is the kind of new infrastructure that you have put in place between 1850 and 1900 or thereabouts. Now I should move to what I call profiling the capital. What is the kind of capital? What was the urban economy like in Madras at this point of time? As I said that you had, on the one hand, the trading agencies with a long history, some of them survived, some of them didn't, who came into Madras as early as the late 18th century, early 19th century, like the Binney's and Parry's. But there were others who came much later after the opening up of the region. So on the one hand, you have the entire organized sector, whether it is finance. The Bank of Madras was set up in 1843 there were three banks set up: Bank of Calcutta, Bank of Bombay, and Bank of Madras, all set up in the mid-19th century. 1843 was when Bank of Madras was set up. They were all amalgamated into what is known as the Imperial Bank of India in 1921, and eventually, after the independence, it became State Bank of India. What State Bank of India was originally the Madras Bank of India in Chennai in 1843. They controlled the entire finances of the state, in addition to financing foreign trade. And then you have what are known as exchange banks. Quite a few of these exchange banks. They were basically multinational exchange banks, which were operating all over the globe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in China, and they had branches in Chennai as well, essentially financing critical import-export trade. The European trading agencies straddled over several things. They were, on the one hand, importing British manufactured goods. They were a conduit or a source for importing all kinds of British manufactured goods, whether it's hardware, whether it's textile, yarn, name it, engineering goods. They were also representing important insurance companies, important shipping companies, agents of important shipping companies, and combined banking. So all these activities, these agency houses like Binny's, Barry's, Best & Co., so they straddled all these areas. Till the first quarter of till the early 20th century, this was largely the picture. I mean, you have the organized sector very much under the grip and control of what I call European capital or British capital, and the Madras Chamber of Commerce and the Madras Harbour was also controlled by them. And they were also represented in the Bank of Madras as directors. So, Binny's, Barry's, Arbuthnot's, Best & Co., Gordon were among the more well-known and large establishments. They exercised enormous control over the urban commercial sector through the straddling of interests, making it impossible for any possible entry by Indian capital into these sectors. The situation in Madras was more akin to Calcutta than Bombay with respect to the relative position of Indian and foreign capital. It's interesting because in Bombay, you see a situation where the Indians do manage to gain an entry, you don't see the kind of control over these sectors exercised by European managing it as you do in Calcutta. The combined export and import trades with banking, shipping, insurance, and some among them went into manufacturing as well. The British were able to maintain this dominance well up until the 20s. There was no significant movement of Indian capital into organized industry in the South till then. This is not to suggest the absence of South Indian capital from all forms of manufacturing. In fact, the height in skin and tanning industry, their presence was quite noticeable. This has much to do with the reluctance of the major fractions of South Indian capital to move into the industry in any big way after the 1940s. Now, I've been looking closely at the formation and structure of Indian capital in the colonial period. And I find that the southern Indian case is rather at variance from what you see elsewhere in Bombay and Bengal and northern India, where the major fractions of merchant capital, which all usually were a part of business communities, whether the Marwadis or the Gujarati Baniyas or the Parsis, all move into industry at a certain point of time when it is found favorable to do so. I mean, the returns on investment are good, but not so in South, because one of the major fractions whom I have studied closely, Rajputi Chettiars, chose to move out of Madras, chose to move out of Tamil Nadu, and went in search of greener pastures in Southeast Asia. Went to Burma, they went to Ceylon, they went to Indochina, they went to Indonesia and Malaysia. And they were financing the whole commercial agriculture in these regions. And the returns which they were able to get, in fact, in a sense, constrained them from coming back into India. Some of them did after the 1970s. I'll talk about that later. And that could be one reason why you don't see the Indian capital is not very visible I mean, they are visible, but they're not visible as much as the British were in Madras at this point in time. Now I'm trying to collapse, for want of time, what really a process which was spread over 40, 50 years into a couple of sentences. What really happens to Indian capital cities? Where are they? I mean, they are essentially in trade, so far as Madras is concerned, as I said, in the 19th century and 20th century, acting as gubashas, acting as middlemen agents, facilitating the movement of crops from the interior. They are also associated with certain kinds of manufacturing processes which are not broadly in the organized sector, such as beedi manufacturing. Chennai was, incidentally, Madras was a major center for beedi manufacturing. So the beedi industry, not industry because much of the beedi is the household industry. So it is outsourced, the tobacco is purchased, and it's outsourced. The owner of the beedi establishment come in contact with beedi workers who are often women and children, men, women and children. A lot of child labor was employed. But the fact is that this was another area. And leather tanning is another area where you see a lot of Indian capital moving into. Those, again, in leather tanning, some of the largest, the entire trade in skin was almost exclusively in the hands of European capital. But the processing, the tanning processes and the establishments, some of the smaller ones were controlled by the Indians, predominantly Muslim capital. But the largest establishments were again European, like the chrome leather factory in Pallavaram, set up sometime around 1904, and the Gordon Woodcroft leather manufacturing company, also in Pallavaram. Two of these units, employing close to 1,000 workers, were very large establishments, which came into being around 1910 or thereabouts. Whereas the Indians go in, they move into what we can call the tertiary sector. They go into banking. Following the collapse of the Arbuthnot Bank in 1906, where the Indians, middle-class Indians, lost a lot of money because Arbuthnot was considered as being one of the most reputed firms, so they deposited a lot of money in this firm, and the firm went bust in 1906. Following which, and this was also the period of Swadeshi, So let's not discount the impact of the Swadeshi movement on the minds of Indians. So you had the Indian, certain sections of Indian merchants coming together to found the Indian Bank, which is still, it's been nationalized, it's still there. It was a combination of Brahmins and Chettiar, as somebody put it in one of the news titles in the Hindu. It was a combination of Brahmin money and Chettiar money. So the Indian Bank was largely controlled, in fact, by the Chettiar, the Chettiar Bank, very much Chettiar Bank, very little of the Brahmin money. That was not quite what we know about it. So that was there. So they moved into finance, to organized banking. Interestingly, post-war, you see, of course, I'm talking about just Madras. If you look elsewhere, you find that Indian capital is moving into the textile. Coimbatore, if you look at Coimbatore, Madura, elsewhere. I'm not about just Madras. Madras, and I'm inclined to believe that it's the kind of control which the British established over this, and there were no particular advantages in establishing a textile industry in Madras, because Madras did not enjoy any of the advantages which Coimbatore or Madurai enjoyed. The only advantage it enjoyed was that it was close to the harbour, but the overseas markets dry up by 1905. In fact, the first textile mill which was established in Madras, interestingly and ironically, is not established by the British, but is established by the Parsi. It's the Parsi gentleman who travels all the way from Bombay and sets up what is known as the South India spinning and weaving mills in a place called Elephant Gate. Apparently, it's still there on Walltax Road. It's very close to the Central Railway Station. It's just beyond. So this gentleman comes all the way from Bombay. It's a Parsi gentleman, but the firm is known as Jahangir Honesty. And why did he decide to come all the way from Bombay to set up this unit? Because one, Bombay was getting crowded. The first textile mill in Bombay was set up in 1853 by Dawar, another Parsi gentleman. And by 1870, it was just getting overcrowded. And so he decided to look for greener pastures and decided to come here. And what was the attraction? The overseas Far Eastern market, because there was a boom in demand for yarn from the handloom industry in China, and it was the Chinese demand. It was to satisfy the Chinese demand for yarn that you have this Parsi gentleman coming all the way to Madras to set this unit up. That was the first unit in 1875. Soon after that, the second mill, set up in a place called Chulai, was also from somebody from Bombay. So this time it turned out to be a Gujarati Bania firm called Mulji Jaitha. So the first two modern textile units which were set up in Madras in 1874 and 1875 respectively were by Indians from non-Tamilian Indians. It's not very successful. The Parsi firm holds up. The Parsi gentleman backs up because, incidentally, the entire technical staff which set up this mill was, it is said, were Europeans and Parsis who set it up. Only the working class was Tamil, but otherwise the entire supervisory staff in both these mills were European. So Indians were very dependent on European know-how, well beyond this time, in fact. And the most successful enterprises, which came into being the following year in 1876, was set up by Binni, the Carnatic mills in 1876, followed by, the Buckingham mills in 1876, followed by the Carnatic mills in 1882, 6 years later. These are the two most successful mills, and probably they are the only mills, along with A&F Harvey in Madura, who could claim to have an all-India market, because their products were so sought after that they were exporting there from Madurai to Bengal, Calcutta. The yarn was being sold, and Binni's products were sold all over India. And Binni also had the advantage, by virtue of being a European firm, it managed to acquire very critical army wartime contracts. The entire army wartime contract for khaki. They were one of the few companies which were manufacturing khaki cloth. So they got this. It was very successful. And of course, Binni had several other interests, textiles just being one of them. So this is the first major industry. Because nobody talks about industry when you talk about Madras. The earliest of Madras is usually a trade. But the fact that I'm trying to say is that there was industry very much there, not possibly very visible, certainly not visible today because it's all folded up. The huge Binni mill complex running into thousands of acres is now being used is a warehouse and it's been used for shooting of films. The Shivaji film was shot in the Binni complex. So the post-independence story of need not detain us here of Binni. It's a tragic story, but it need not detain us here. Binni became part of the Inchcape group following their near collapse. In fact, Binni nearly collapsed in 1906 because of the Arbuthnot. Because Arbuthnot and Binni, both of them were into banking, and there was a run on Binni's as well. But fortunately for them, Lord Inchcape came to the rescue of Binni's, and he was an extremely wealthy man. It's a multinational Inchcape group. So Binni, fortunately, because of this connection, was flushed with capital and has never looked back until at least my story ends. So they were one of the leading textile firms. They held their own well after independence. Now, textiles provided employment to roughly 11,000 workers. What are the other industries, when we talk about Chennai coming up? I talked about hides and skin. Where were they located? Madavaram. What were the other
The next one.
Yeah. No, not even this. Yeah, this is a very recent map, but it'll tell you where things are. Yeah, this was one center where your leather. It's very interesting, because if you look at the social-spatial morphology of the city, I mean, you had, this is the Georgetown, this is where the commercial headquarters, at this point of time of all these guys, there were Indians also here. And then the industries are in the outskirts. Where is, Perambur, Chule is somewhere close to that. And then Tiruvatiyur, Tondeyarpet, Madavaram, these are the industrial centers. And the Hyson skin were in Madavaram, some of them, and the other concentration was in Pallavaram. Yeah, this is the other major center, Hyson skin. Then you have matches. Following the tariff protection in 1923, you have a number of small enterprises coming up and setting up. Of course, we all know the Shivakashi story. Shivakashi story also begins around that time. But it is interesting to see that if you look at the entire Tamil region, you see that they're spatially fairly dispersed. The Shivakashi concentration happens much later. I'm talking about the pre-Shivakashi concentration. And there were as many as 10 units in about this area, Tondeyarpet area, small units employing 30 workers, 40 workers and making matches. All Indian customers. Come 1929, you had the Swedish multinational, Swedish AB. They decided to, because of tariff protection, they decided to jump the tariff barriers and set up units in India. So they begin by setting up the largest unit in a place called Ambernath in Bombay, near Bombay, the outskirts of Bombay, Wimco. Then one in Calcutta, one in Bareilly, and the fourth unit in 1929 in Tiruvatiyur in Madras, employing as many as 775 workers. And if you look at the, you have this very interesting data, of course, not very authentic because like all quantitative data garnered by the government in those days, there are limitations. But despite the limitations, whatever it's worth, it does lend itself to a certain pattern. And you see that all these 10 units, the moment Wimco comes here, they are not able to withstand Wimco's competition and they disappear. So there is deindustrialization happening, the match is disappearing. By the 1930s, late 30s, all these 10 units have disappeared. They don't figure. There's only Wimco. Under matches for Madras, only one unit. So that was a major unit. What are the others? You have vegetable oil. Post-war, you have some of these multinational companies setting up. There is a Danish firm called East Asiatic Company, the Danish, which was actually exporting oil seeds from India to Europe, decided to set up applied for a license to set up a Vanaspati unit, and they set up a East Asiatic Vanaspati company in Tondeyarpet. Okay, they employ 158 workers. Close on the heels of East Asiatic Company, you have another multinational called Raleigh and Company, also setting up another vegetable oil industry in Royapuram, employing 160. And there are any number of smaller units, also manufacturing about 7 or 8 of them. So you have vegetable oils emerging. Then the other important things, not strictly, they can't be strictly classified as industry, but they're important because if you want to understand today's contemporary history, and Chennai, everybody is talking about Chennai having emerged as an auto hub. Yes, it is a fact. I think there is a prehistory to this. And if you look at, I have looked at the import-export trade statistics of almost all the commodities, and you can see the pronounced gap between Bombay and Calcutta for all commodities, because they were much bigger centers in importing. But when it comes to automobiles, and you look at the pattern, it changes. The gap between Bombay and Calcutta and Madras is very small. So, Madras, obviously, there was a middle class which was emerging following the First World War and all the profits that it made over time, and which had a voracious appetite for motor cars. So if you look at the number of motor cars which are being imported, motorcycles, motor cars, lorries, and buses. So broadly, the transport sector is booming in Chennai. If you look at especially the 1930s and 40s. Now, if you look at the coach building and motor repair workshops, I mean, I'm not treating them as industry, but they're important because you can see the beginnings of the rise of a skilled workforce. You know, because these cars had to be stripped, they had to be maintained, the parts had to be replaced, sometimes the parts were locally manufactured. You had foundries coming up again in the same area. A lot of foundries were coming up here. And interestingly, all the motor workshops, if you look at there was something like 20, 30 workshops which came into being, some of them employing as many as 500, 600 workers. Simpson and Company had, I think, close to 1,000 workers in their workshop. And Simpson and Company was producing during the Second World War, since there were severe restrictions on imports, and you couldn't import oil, and particularly oil because of war. Madras was starved of fuel. So what do these guys come up with? They come up with producer gas plants using charcoal. And who manufactures them? There are only two companies which manufacture them. Simpson and Co. and TVS. TVS is doing it in Madurai, and Simpson is doing it in Madras. So obviously they were into manufacturing as well, though they were essentially importers of vehicles. And they had these establishments for maintaining this, for repair and maintenance. But the interesting thing is that they were in a sense grooming a whole generation of skilled workers, because that is very important. So there is a certain engineering skill which is emerging in Chennai from the 1930s and 40s. Likewise, if you look at some of the engineering workshops, all the bigger ones were European. And this is what I reiterate my point that the European dominance continues right up to the 1940s. So you don't have all the major players. Crompton Engineering was Konditoppu Tiruvottiur. Again, huge establishment. Binny Engineering Works, Beachline Road, again very close to the harbour. Richardson Cludas, Royapuram. Massey, Royapuram. This is where all the large engineering establishments, because there were all kinds of engineering goods which needed to be repaired and serviced. So this is so far as the organized sort of sector is concerned. So you see, and another very interesting thing, you have for the first time the beginnings of change which are visible and which become much more evident after independence. Is for the first time you have an Indian entrepreneur. Of course, now he's huge and he's big, called the TI Group, AMM Murugappa Group. You must have heard of that group. He moves into a very unconventional field by starting a firm called Ajax Products Limited in 1939 in Tiruvottiur. They manufacture steel office equipment and later move into manufacture emery paper. So that is so far as the organized sector. So what is the unorganized sector? I mean, you have, as I said, BD, tailoring, and there are coolies and craftsmen. So there is a huge, so you have the rise of a modern working class in the organized sector in all these industries that I mentioned. But then you also have a large unorganized sector, the service sector. Some of them don't get referred. There's a very interesting report which was published sometime in 1936, 1937. It's a report of the family budgets of industrial workers in both the organized and unorganized sector. It was based on a sample study, and it looked at the family budget and also looked at the condition of the workers, in terms of their health, in terms of their nutrition and diet, and the general economic position. And the report is very, very revealing, because it shows that 90% of the workers in the organized sector, they covered textiles, they covered the railway workshop in Perambur, and they covered the oil installations in this thing, Ennore. That's where the oil installations were there. Oil had to be imported, stored, and then transported. And they found that 90% of the workers in the organized industry were indebted. The nutritive and caloric value of the food consumed was below standards. Living conditions unhealthy and unsanitary. High morbidity and infant mortality. These were the principal findings of this report insofar as the organized workers in the organized sector were concerned, whose wages were much higher than those who were in the unorganized sector. In the unorganized sector, I talked about BD, tailoring, coolies in the harbor coolies, the large segment of labor which was employed in the harbor directly by the port trust as well as by contractors for transporting the goods from the warehouses to the pier and to the harbor and then loaded onto the ship. They were very poorly paid. It was a seasonal activity, and especially after the depression, there was a slump in the import and export trade, and that affected them, and their condition was even worse. Now, to sum up, I think I've gone on and on. I think the city was totally transformed drastically in the course of 100 years, giving rise to new classes and new conflicts. Urban poverty and squalor and the sharp societal divide was what the British left behind. I'm sorry to have to end on a rather pessimistic note, but what you see today is something which we have inherited as well. There are historical sort of, you can trace the history of this. But it was a very transformed city by 47. Thank you.
Place as a place, Britishers had brought in a lot of weavers from Madurai and Tirunelveli, and there were these group of people called Velas, after Velala areas. So they were basically these industrial workers who used to do a lot of these textile yarn, maybe not power. So what happened to the handicraft or whatever, handloom industry? Were they in contention with the textile?
No. There's not much reference to handlooms here, because handloom industry in Madras it was a major. I don't know which period you're referring to. Because if you're referring to the pre-1850 period, yes, it was a very major center. Because and that's precisely what I said, that there is a dramatic shift in the whole, what shall I say, investment pattern of the city. Because prior to 1850, I mean, especially the 17th century, it was a slow process between 1640 when Khan lands here, and there are certain weavers whom he brings along from Machilipatnam. You see, what happens is that the East India Company, by the time the East India Company entered the eastern coast, it was already getting crowded. The Dutch and Portuguese were already there, sourcing for the same textiles. So therefore, they had to settle for Machilipatnam. And so the Machilipatnam thing is closed down, and then they moved to Chennai and to Madras in 1640. And gradually, it's a very slow process. They are able to motivate people to bring weavers around by inducement and by force, an element of force as well. So they are settled in all these These were all villages actually. Santom was in fact with the Portuguese, while Fort St. George was with the Brits, but Santom was with the Portuguese. And Fort St. David was with the Dutch. And further south, the Danish, who were the weakest of these four, and the French, of course, were in Pondy. And then you had Tarangambadi, what was Tranquebar, Tarangambadi in Tamil, where the Danish were located. So you had all these four. And so the weavers were induced to come and settle down there. And textiles was big, very big, not just in India, all over India. That's the major debate in my discipline, the deindustrialization, the decline of the handlooms. Of course, not in South. South they managed to survive for other reasons. But it'd be interesting to see what happens to them because there is not very much reference to the handloom industry in Madras after in the course of the 19th and 20th century. I'm sure they must have been there in the outlying areas somewhere. We have to look, but in the available literature there is not much. The Madras Handloom Cooperative Society has a small outlet somewhere, but handlooms is not listed, at least in Madras, as a major activity in the course of the late 19th and 20th century, the period which I have looked at closely.
Would be, if you're focusing on British sources or things like that, the English archive, might there be other, or might there be sources that you can list for activities?
Sure, these are all, some of them are colonial archives, some of them are books on firms, histories of firms. Then I talked about this, you have these list of large-scale industrial establishments with power and without power, which are really trying to capture the small and the medium. That list is there, You have a time series going back in time to the late 19th century to beyond 1940, 47. So I've looked at that. What are the other sources? Newspapers, contemporary newspapers, a whole range of sources, archival materials. Yeah, but I'm sure one, I suppose, looks around, there might be other kinds of sources. One may have to look at some summer sources may yield different kind of cost. Worth looking at here. But insofar as some of my basic arguments, I don't think there is any dispute about these are all established. You can't, the large establishment, the control of the British, European managing agencies, that I think is incontrovertible because we know these are all hard established facts, so they are available, they are public listed companies, so you know how much capital they have promoted. We may not know how much profit they have siphoned. Those kinds of information, we are still handicapped. Yeah.
I was more interested in you were saying that there's not much information about the working class.
On the working class, yes.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
What I meant was, in the colonial archive, the working class figures only when there is a working class struggle. They get noticed when there is a struggle, when there is a strike, when there is a lockout. Then the labor department steps in and therefore makes it its business to inquire and report about it. So that is our source. But you're right, I'm sure it will also be reported in contemporary newspapers, some of them. Yeah. But I was making a different point. What I was saying is that hitherto in the historiography of Indian labor, you've really looked at only the organized sector, workers. The focus has been on the organization of the workers as industrial workers. So there's a whole range of workers who don't fall within the ambit of the organized sector. It's difficult to get data about their range.
any factory known as now, I mean, where the Shivaji was shot. You just mentioned that this unit is a
See, what happened was, I'll tell you, Inchcape lost interest in this part of the world. It's part of the Inchcape group. They moved on. They felt that textiles was not their cup of tea. They decided to exit from textiles and decided to sold. Otherwise, they would have had
some film studios that we may try more famous.
That I don't know. In Perambur, Binni. If you ask the Binni, then it's still known as Binni. That's a very famous landmark.
I think they merged Pakistan and thematic myth. Now known as Pakistan and thematic.
BNC mill. BNC mill. It's known as BNC mill. So nobody says Pakistan and BNC. BNC mill, Perambur.
It's now dead. I mean,
It's there. So what happened was, it was bought up by very well-known industrialist in Coimbatore called G.K. Devaraj. Devaraj himself, he has a very successful Lakshmi mill, the famous Lakshmi mills of Coimbatore. Yeah, LMW. LMW came later. He couldn't run it either. So then it was bought up by this liquor baron called Odia. Now, textiles and liquor, come on. So, obviously he couldn't manage it, and so it turned sick. It was acquired by BFIR, went up for sale, there were no takers. Now they're interested in the land. You see, it's very interesting how working class areas, what were predominantly working class areas, are being appropriated by the middle class now. So there's prime value for that land. It runs to something like 1,300 acres. 1,300 acres of prime land in Perambur. They're not interested in the mill. They just want the land. That's how things stand. And I met some of the workers. They've still not been paid dues. So there's a union office off the mill, outside the mill. So I went and met some of the workers, erstwhile workers. And they had a litany of complaints and protests and how they haven't got their dues yet.
What was the speech?
Sorry?
What was the document?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. Part of it has been sold, I think. This Kalpati firm tried to buy it.
And second question. I think I discussed this with you earlier actually about that whole which case was the industry or the services sector in general. But I think it's, from what you said, it's like kind of gone through and through for quite some time. Like services and then industry again, and then that got and moved on. But one thing I wanted to look at is
Services predates industry.
Yeah.
I mean,
but it keeps going back and forth.
Yeah, it keeps going back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes the whole automobile house and all that. Major question is, when did railways become a major impact center, for moving of goods from Chennai? Because if you look at it, the places that you marked out, they're all on the national highway. Like Pallavaram was on the GST. Perambur and Washerman Belt and all that. They're all on the.
This is the one.
Okay, but that's what, right? Railways came in.
Yeah. So first road I told you till Walaja just before Katpadi.
Yeah.
Okay. Then it slowly extends.
No. What I mean to ask is like, were the industrial centers like set up based on the roadways before the railways came in, kind of thing? Like, because if you look at it, if you look at the previous one.
Yeah.
So
there is a close link between
River Fuel and all falls under the Chennai Calcutta.
Sure.
And then further down like this side, which is the GST.
That was a major consideration.
So road predates movement of railways.
Road, there are very few mills which predate railways,
Okay.
And so far as south is concerned.
Okay.
In fact, even north, Calcutta is perhaps an exception. A few of them came up before the railways,
Right. Okay.
but not very much before.
Okay.
The major spurt in industrial investment all across India
Happened
is post-railways. There is a close link. Because many of these commodities initially were not for the internal market.
Yeah.
Because the purchasing, it is also linked up to the fact that purchasing power of the people was very low. They could hardly afford this. So it was exported. Yarn was exported. Whether in Bombay, in Madras.
major railway line was that Palajapet and
In fact, very interesting. This is a major center for hides and skins. So that was the first stretch which was. It was very easy to source your hides and skins from there. Then it slowly extended. The last line is 1897 is Metropolitan Nilgiri. That is 1897. Simpson is part of the amalgamation group. They bought up Addison. So, they were doing very well. I was talking about Simpson, So they were into automobiles in a very big way. And then they expand. But much of their growth is post-independence. They were a major group. Essentially importing, servicing, road transport. You see the two major road transport, one was TVS Roadways, the entire South Madras, that is Madras, Krishnapalli, that road was monopolized by TVS. And then you have Shriram Vilas Service, controlled by Simpson. They were each having a fleet of several hundreds of buses. They had their own retreading plants, maintenance, bus depots, employing a lot of drivers and conductors, and running. It was very prosperous. In fact, the railways were so threatened, in 1945 they wanted to avoid railroad competition. They wanted to set up a joint company with representatives of roads and railways, in which they wanted somebody from Simpson and TVS to be part of it. But somehow it fell through. They wanted to avoid needless competition between them. One of the reasons why the southern region, Tamil Nadu in particular, scores over large parts of other regions is this dense network of roads, which was laid even in those days. So you were not entirely dependent on railways. You had also a network of roads.
Would we start PD
but no, it doesn't, because the first motor car comes into Madras in 1905 or thereabouts, as late as that. Either 1902 or 1905, don't know exact. We don't have the exact, but there is a reference to the first. You could see the first car. Some Western gentleman had imported the first car. One of those cars. So, palanquins and bullock carts. And they're complaining about the state of the roads in the mid-19th century. Sure.
So, thank you very much.
I hope it was.
Yes.
Thank you very much.